He's a despicable man. He hates the poor and the downtrodden, and he spits on the very face of democracy. And he's also right. Good evening once again, everybody. This is Hell's Unicorn again. And it appears that democracy is now dead in Wisconsin. Thank God for that. You see, the entire effort of this entire recall election that's been going on for the past several months in Wisconsin has been about one thing: political issues. Now, the question that we all need to ask ourselves is this really the proper function of a recall? In my recollection, recall elections are usually reserved for periods where there is cronyism, corruption, or something else that would suggest that some violation of law or general ethics of the office holder is in play. But we don't really have any of that here. Rush Limbaugh, I think, actually referred to this as the so-called political left's attempt at criminalizing dissent. I would argue that in a democratic system, all forms of dissent can at any time become criminal, depending on who shows up at the polls. And indeed, the very concept of this entire push was the notion of mob rule style direct democracy. The notion that the many, led by a few, in this case union bosses, have the specific right to fleece taxpayers in one of the most gratuitous of fashions possible. When a public sector union collectively bargains, who are they bargaining with? Theoretically, they're bargaining with the American people because that's who's paying their salary. However, the representatives that are elected to the government are the ones who ultimately make the decision regardless of who is actually paying the bills. And so, in the name of political opportunism, very many politicians can get away with giving a lot of free handouts to a lot of different special interests. And this public sector union business just basically adds insult to injury by not only stating that a politician is free to give out favors to these groups in exchange for votes, which in my opinion constitutes bribery for the sake of collecting votes, but it also puts it under the guise of poor people supposedly negotiating for a better deal so that they can have a living wage, which is ridiculous. As small of a paycheck a teacher or some other public sector worker may have in a given situation compared to some corporate fat cat who's not in any way connected with either, it's a hell of a lot more than what most people out in the private sector working for a living are actually making. And they don't get all the benefits in a lot of cases. They don't get the summers off. They don't get the mandatory vacation time. They don't get the retirement benefits necessarily. Out in the real world, you have to plan for your own retirement, and you have to make do with what you've got in order to procure your own benefits. So in essence, the real income of all of these public sector people is probably about 30 to 40% higher than it appears to be based on what their yearly annual salary is. Nevertheless, I have no problem with teachers, fire personnel, police, what have you, making lots of money, provided that they do it based on the merits of their labor and by the consent of their employers. And that is what has been restored through the efforts of one Scott Walker, the current governor of Wisconsin. Now, mind you, I am not necessarily a Scott Walker fan. I barely know anything about the guy. He's the governor of a state that I don't live in and that I've never been to. I've been to Minnesota once, but I have never been to Wisconsin. So the only thing that I really have to go on is the one issue that everybody keeps yammering about, and that's the public sector union reforms that he proposed. Now, granted, this is the exact same policy that our federal government has with its public sector union workers. So, for all of you that are now whining and crying about how democracy is dead and gone from Wisconsin, dry your tears. get an education. Start to think in terms of long-sighted, long-term financial betterment and overall prosperity for everybody. And then you'll realize that the death of democracy is not only not a bad thing, but it is also necessary for all our sakes. With prudence to myself and benevolence to all of you, good evening.